Alright students, welcome to SPSS Inferential Statistics. Note, you will not find this lecture anywhere in your textbook in any particular chapter. Really, this whole focus of this lecture is to just going to give you a nice primer for all of the inferential statistical tests that we're going to learn in the upcoming weeks, and really to give you a play-by-play on how to use SPSS to run the analyses for all of these tests. So the objectives for this lecture are to know which inferential test to run based upon the number and level of measurement of your variables. And again, this is a similar objective that we had last week in Chapter 9, where we just really started to talk about what types of tests we're going to do and the plan that we're going to have for all of our tests. Remember the 5 steps that we're going to have for hypothesis testing. And so in addition to knowing which tests we're going to run, we also really want to know the mechanics of correctly running and interpreting SPSS output for each of these following tests. The independent samples t-test, the dependent samples t-test, also known as the paired samples t-test, and number 1 and number 2 is what we're going to first cover next week in more detail. We'll also cover Pearson's chi-square, one-way ANOVA, and Pearson's correlation coefficients. So each of these 5 tests in this lecture for this week, you will learn how to run these analyses in SPSS. So why this lecture is important is really the steps that you're going to be learning here, you're going to need to know how to do in homework 4 and possibly homework 5. And for your upcoming mini quizzes in terms of interpreting SPSS output, which we've done already to some degree, also in quiz 3, and also obviously in your final exam. And so it'll be looking at SPSS output, but not necessarily testing you on the procedures. The procedures, where you're going to be tested upon that, is the final project. I'm going to give you a data set where you're going to come up with your own independent variable, dependent variable, your own research question, and answer that research question based upon the data set that's given to you, and you're going to then run descriptive statistics, run your inferential statistics to answer your question. So you're going to want to go ahead and refer to this lecture as well as the SPSS descriptive statistics lecture on really how to get these tables and run these analyses in SPSS. Okay, so let's set up the scenario here. A zombie virus outbreak has just hit Cal State Fullerton. The military has barricaded the campus. There's no escape. You are a health science researcher and want to determine how to increase survival among Cal State Fullerton students. You developed a cure that works on students during their early stage of infection, but it is in short supply. You managed to find 20 participants, some of which were infected before you cured them. You asked them a series of questions and then performed statistical analyses to determine the best way for students to optimize their chances of survival. So let's take a look at the zombie dataset itself. Make sure you go to Titanium and download the zombie dataset. You can only open it if you have SPSS installed on the computer or if you're using a virtual computer lab. So let's head on over to SPSS to take a look at the dataset. Okay, so here we have our zombie dataset. So we are in variable view. Here is data view. So let's take a look at our variables. We see we have how many variables in our data set? We have 11. You see we have 1, 2, 3, obviously down to 11. So let's take a look at each of these variables in a little bit more detail. So we have our first variable is the student's name, and we can see the label itself, student's name. Obviously there are no values, and this level of measurement for this variable is nominal. So now we see we have our variable gender, and that is measuring gender. And we see our values, our possible responses for gender. If we click on values here, you'll see this little box here. If we click on that, it'll open up what the possible values are for our variable gender. And we see we have males and females. We see males are coded as 0 and females are coded as 1. And we see the level of measurement for gender is nominal. We see we have variable race, and that is measuring race, ethnicity. So let's see what different types of ethnicities we have for this data set. So it looks like we have 6 different types of ethnicities that we collected. We have white, black, Asian, Hispanic, mixed, or other. And we see, if you look at the level of measurement for race ethnicity, nominal. And then we have a variable GPA. And what is this measuring? Well, it looks like we asked our students, what is your GPA? So given this, let's look at our values. We see we have no values. So that means if we just ask what is your GPA, our students are just going to give us a number. So given that, we have the level of measurement as scale, which means it's going to be interval or ratio. It's going to be some quantitative numerical answer. We see we have our variable exercise, and this is asking students, how many hours do you exercise per week? Again, we have no values, no labels, because in this type of variable, it's interval ratio, scale variable. In this case, the answer to this question is going to be an actual number. Looking at our 6th variable, the variable name is number encountered. Well, what does that measure? Well, if we look at the label, this is telling us how many zombies have you encountered? And we see this is just going to be another number. There's no values, and we see the level of measurement is scale. We see we have a variable action, and this is measuring what did you do when you encountered a zombie. Well, let's take a look at what some of the responses were. Students either decided to run and hide, they either decided to fight the zombie, they either screamed, or they called or texted someone. And we see the level of measurement for this variable, nominal as well. We see we have our variable weapon. And weapon is really measuring what did you carry for self-defense. So if we take a look at our values, we can see our possible responses. Students either carried nothing, carried a blunt object, a sharp object, something flammable, pepper spray, or something other. And we see level of measurement, also nominal. We see our variable infected. So what does this mean? Were you infected? We asked those 20 students if they were infected. Let's see what the responses are. No, which is a 0, and yes, which is a 1. And again, also nominal. And then we have this variable, fear pre-outbreak. Well, what does fear pre-outbreak mean? Well, how frightened were you before the outbreak? And we can take a look to see what the possible responses are. Not frightened at all, slightly worried, worried, scared, or panicked. And if we take a look, we see the level of measurement is ordinal. So let's take a look at those responses again. Not frightened at all, slightly worried, worried, scared, and panicked. So we have some hierarchy, some order in terms of fear level. Those who said 1 were not frightened at all. They had barely no fear at all. Compared to those who had 5 panicked, well, you're filled with fear at that point. And then we have fear post-outbreak, which measured how frightened are you after the outbreak. Again, we have our same 5 responses, not frightened at all the way to panicked. So now that we have a nice, good sense of our variables, let's take a look at our data. And here we see we have how many participants. Well, here's the rows. Here's Simon. He's our 20th participant. Well, that makes sense. Thinking about when we set up the scenario, we had 20 participants that we said you surveyed as a health science researcher. And we can see Joe, Sherry, Helena, we see all the data for each of these students. Notice it's all just numbers. Even though we know that some of these responses aren't actually numbers. So if we go back up here, remember this button that I introduced, if we click on this, it toggles back and forth the labels and the codes. Right? Thinking about infection. Those who weren't infected had no but also coded as a 0, because SPSS really doesn't work with words, it works with numbers in order to do analyses. Okay, so now that we know what our variables are, we can perform statistical analyses to best determine the way for students to optimize their chances of survival. So here is our table that we saw last week. Different types of inferential statistical tests that we're going to learn in the coming weeks. And so here we have our difference tests, right, looking at our nominal and ordinal variables. And this is when we treat our ordinal variables just using the categories themselves. Instead of trying to calculate a mean and standard deviation, if we try to do that, then we're going down this column. And then we have our dependent variable. Depending on the level of measurement, it's going to dictate what type of test we're going to do. But down this column, if our independent variable is nominal, or categorical rather, nominal by default or ordinal in the sense that we're looking and treating it as categories. So when our independent variable is categorical, we're really doing difference tests because we want to see what are the differences between all of our groups, all of our categories that we're looking at. And we're either going to look at differences between groups on differences on outcomes in terms of different groups like nominal ordinal variables, or if we're going to be comparing means, and these means and each of these groups have their own means, we're looking at this cell here. We're looking at the different t-tests, or if we're looking at an ANOVA, looking at differences between groups. And then if we're looking at relationship tests, this is when we're going to learn how to conduct Pearson's correlation coefficient. Up to this point, we know how to do it by hand. But now we want to look at how do we perform the analysis in SPSS to give us the tables that we know how to read, give us those correlation matrices. Okay, so now that we've introduced our data set, let's go ahead and take a look at how we perform the first statistical test, which is independent samples t-test. Go ahead and go to video 2 of this week.